Poor Cary Grant was a little nervous about it because I'm very short-sighted, and of course I couldn't wear my glasses driving. So it was all he could do to look nonchalant and relaxed.
Everybody thinks Grace Kelly's story is the ultimate fairy tale. Hollywood actress becomes a real-life princess, marries into royalty, gets the crown, the castle, the whole thing. And honestly, from the outside, it looked perfect. But what if I told you that behind those palace walls, Grace Kelly's life slowly unraveled into something far darker than any of her movies? And what if Prince Rainier, the man who gave her that fairy tale, was also the man who quietly destroyed her? Today, we're getting into all of it. The affairs, the control, the depression, and that devastating car crash that changed everything forever. The deal that started it all. Let's rewind to 1956, because before we talk about what went wrong, we need to talk about why this marriage happened in the first place. And honey, it is not the love story they sold us. Prince Rainier III of Monaco had a problem. A very specific, very political problem. See, Monaco's 1918 treaty with France had a clause that said if the ruling Grimaldi family didn't produce an heir, Monaco would be absorbed into France. The whole tiny country, gone, just like that. And Rainier, who had been ruling since 1949, was running out of time. He needed a wife. He needed a glamorous wife. One who could put Monaco on the map, fill the royal coffers with tourism dollars, and give him children. So what does he do? He reaches out through connections at MGM Studios, yes, the film studio, and arranges to meet one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. Grace Kelly. Now here's where it gets truly wild. MGM, the studio, was deeply involved in making this whole thing happen. The introduction was facilitated through press connections during the 1955 Cannes Film Festival, where Grace was sent to represent MGM. The marriage itself generated a level of global publicity that money simply cannot buy. Monaco went from an obscure principality most people couldn't find on a map to the most glamorized address in Europe, virtually overnight. This wasn't just a love match, it was a transaction. Grace brought Hollywood glamour, international attention, and the Kelly family's Philadelphia blue blood pedigree. Rainier got his heir, his prestige, and his country's survival. Now, was Grace swept up in the romance of it? Probably, yes. By all accounts, she was genuinely excited about Rainier in the beginning. But she was also 26 years old at the peak of her career and being presented with a real-life crown by a real-life prince. The fairy tale was intoxicating. It was only later, much later, that she'd understand exactly what she'd traded for it. And Grace? Well, Grace got a crown she never fully asked for, and a life she was never truly prepared for. But wait, if this whole thing was built on image and political necessity from the start, what did that mean for what came next inside that marriage? The marriage was troubled from day one. Y'all, I cannot stress this enough. The ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry before things started going sideways. The couple married on April 19, 1956, in what was called the wedding of the century. The dress, designed by MGM's own costume department, was a masterpiece of silk taffeta and Brussels lace. The photos were iconic. The whole world was watching. Over 30 million people tuned into television and radio broadcasts of the ceremony. And almost immediately after, behind closed doors, the cracks started showing. Now, let me be precise here, because this matters. Some sources claim Rainier was unfaithful during the marriage, though there's no definitive documentation of specific affairs or mistresses. What is documented, what close friends reported consistently, is that Grace confided she was deeply unhappy in her marriage. people in her inner circle described a woman who felt unseen, unheard, and profoundly lonely inside one of the most photographed relationships on Earth. And that's somehow even sadder than the tabloid version, isn't it? Because it means the real tragedy wasn't scandalous. It was quiet. It was daily. It was the kind of unhappiness that doesn't make headlines. It just hollows a person out over time. But the emotional distance was only one part of the problem, because Rainier didn't just fail to love Grace the way she needed. He controlled her completely. So what exactly did that control look like? And what did Grace Kelly lose because of it? The gilded cage. Everything Grace lost. Here's the thing about Grace Kelly that people forget. Before she was a princess, she was a serious actress. She won an Academy Award. She worked with Alfred Hitchcock. She was at the absolute peak of her career when she married Rainier. And one of the first things Rainier did after the wedding? He banned her from acting. Full stop. No negotiation. No compromise. The woman who had been nominated for Oscars, who had starred in Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, and The Country Girl, was simply not allowed to act anymore. When Alfred Hitchcock personally reached out and asked Grace to come back and star in his film Marnie, she begged Rainier to let her do it. She genuinely wanted this. And he said no. And it wasn't just Hitchcock. Grace was approached multiple times over the years about potential film projects. Each time, the answer from the palace was the same. No. The argument was that it would be undignified for the Princess of Monaco to appear on screen. But the effect was something far more specific. It cut Grace off from the one thing in her life that had been entirely, authentically hers. So she tried to find other outlets. She threw herself into poetry, eventually performing public readings under the name Grace de Monaco, and even recording a poetry album. She got involved in flower arranging, charitable work, arts foundations. She tried to build a creative life within the walls she'd been given. And Rainier? He couldn't even be bothered to show up for her poetry readings. There were years where he simply didn't attend, the one public creative pursuit she had left, and her own husband treated it like an inconvenience. That's not love. That's control. And it wasn't just the acting career. Rainier systematically isolated Grace from her Hollywood world, her A-list friendships, her creative community, the life she'd built in California. All of it got slowly cut off. She was now property of Monaco. Her schedule, her appearance, her public statements, all controlled by palace protocol. She went from being one of the most celebrated women in Hollywood to being a figurehead in a tiny principality on the French Riviera, attending charity galas and ribbon cuttings and royal obligations that she never signed up for. Grace had 3 children, Caroline in 1957, Albert in 1958, and Stephanie in 1965. And by most accounts, she raised them largely alone, while Rainier remained emotionally distant as a father. So here's what I keep thinking about. At what point does a fairy tale become a trap? And when Grace finally hit that point, what happened to her? The children she loved, and the palace that got in the way. Here's a part of Grace's story that almost never gets the attention it deserves: who she was as a mother. And honestly, understanding that relationship tells you everything about how she was surviving inside that marriage. Grace adored her children. By every account, from people who were actually inside the palace, from staff, from friends who visited, from the children themselves in later interviews, Grace was the emotional center of that family. The warmth, the affection, the bedtime stories, the birthday traditions. That was Grace, not Rainier. Rainier was physically present in the palace, but emotionally, He operated like a sovereign first and a father second, or maybe third, maybe fourth. And here's the heartbreaking irony of that. The very children that Grace was expected to provide for the sake of Monaco's political survival, those children became the one source of genuine joy and purpose she had left. She poured everything she couldn't put into her career, everything she couldn't express publicly, everything Rainier wouldn't receive from her emotionally. She poured all of it into Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie. But even that wasn't simple, because raising children inside a royal institution isn't the same as raising children inside a home. There were protocols, there were expectations, there were palace staff and press obligations, and the constant awareness that these weren't just her kids, they were Monaco's future. The children had roles to perform almost from birth, and Grace, who understood better than anyone what it felt like to be trapped inside a role, was determined that they wouldn't lose themselves the way she had. She fought, reportedly, to give them as much normalcy as possible. She wanted them in regular schools for as long as feasible. She wanted them to have real friendships, not just the sterile, curated social circles that palace life tends to produce. She took them on trips. She read with them. She tried, within the constraints of everything surrounding her, to be a real mother rather than a royal figurehead in a tiara. And the children, in their own ways, reflected exactly what their upbringing had given them and exactly what it had cost them. Caroline, the eldest, clashed famously with both her parents during adolescence. Her early romantic choices caused major tension with Rainier in particular, but she and Grace reportedly had a relationship that, while complicated, ran deep. Caroline later became one of the most important figures in Monaco's public life, and people who knew her well said she carried a lot of grace in her. The same internal discipline, the same elegance, and the same quiet sadness underneath. Albert, the heir, was shaped heavily by palace duty in the way that male heirs in royal families tend to be, formed more by institutional expectation than by emotional connection. He has spoken publicly about missing his mother, about wishing he'd had more time with her, about the specific kind of grief that comes from losing a parent when you're still young enough to have needed more of them. And then there's Stephanie. Stephanie, the youngest. Born in 1965, she was only 17 years old when she was sitting in that passenger seat on September 13, 1982. She survived. Her mother didn't. And the weight of that, the specific, brutal weight of surviving a crash that killed your mother, of being the last person who saw Princess Grace alive, that weight followed Stephanie for decades. She spiraled publicly in the years after Grace's death. Romantic scandals, career pivots, controversies that kept her name in tabloids for all the wrong reasons. And it's so easy, from the outside, to look at that and make it a narrative about recklessness or rebellion. But when you understand what she went through on that mountain road, when you understand that she was a teenager who watched her mother die and then spent the rest of her life with people quietly wondering what really happened in that car, it reads completely differently. Grace spent her whole marriage quietly fighting for her children to be seen as full human beings inside a palace that wanted them to be symbols. The cruelest final irony is that her death is part of what ensured they never quite got to be either. Grace's depression, the truth nobody wanted to talk about. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Grace Kelly, Princess Grace of Monaco, was quietly falling apart. She gained weight. She became depressed. She started relying on pills and alcohol to cope with the life she was living. Friends who visited her said they saw her crying constantly. She reportedly described her existence as being trapped in a palace prison. Not a fairy tale, a prison. Think about that for a second. The woman the entire world envied, The woman little girls dreamed of becoming, was sitting behind palace walls crying and drinking to get through her days. And here's the part that really gets me. Grace had no real outlet for any of this. She couldn't act. She couldn't leave. She couldn't publicly express unhappiness without creating an international incident. She was the face of a fairy tale that millions of people needed to believe in, and she was completely trapped inside it. She reportedly talked about leaving, about going back to America, about finding some version of a life that felt like her own. But Monaco needed Princess Grace, the symbol, the brand, the image. And so Grace Kelly, the actual human being, stayed and suffered quietly and smiled for the cameras. And the saddest part? None of this was really a secret to the people around her. Her close friends knew. Her children knew on some level. But the palace kept the image pristine. Grace was always photographed smiling, always dressed immaculately, always performing the role she'd been purchased to play. She was an actress, after all. She knew how to perform. But even the image started cracking in small ways the palace couldn't fully control. By the late 70s, journalists and royal watchers had started quietly noticing that Grace didn't seem like the same woman from the Hitchcock years. The spark people remembered from her Hollywood interviews? It had dimmed. Former friends described phone calls where she'd sound exhausted, isolated, emotionally drained. And remember, this was long before celebrities were openly talking about mental health or burnout. Back then, women in unhappy marriages, especially royal women, were expected to smile harder and wear prettier dresses. And Grace did exactly that. She kept hosting events, kept waving at crowds, kept standing beside Rainier, looking polished and serene, while rumors about tension inside the marriage kept circulating underneath the surface. There were also reports that she felt increasingly trapped by palace expectations as she got older, especially as Monaco transformed into a global luxury playground that depended heavily on her image. Grace wasn't just a wife at that point. She was practically Monaco's biggest marketing asset, which is honestly one of the bleakest parts of this whole story, because the thing that made Grace internationally beloved, her warmth, elegance, and charisma, became the exact thing the institution around her relied on to survive. The more unhappy she became privately, the more important it became publicly that she looked perfect. And meanwhile, Hollywood kept moving without her. An entire generation of actresses came up after Grace Kelly retired. New stars, new films, new eras, and every now and then, she'd reconnect with old friends from the industry and reportedly talk about the projects she never got to make, the career she walked away from at 26 years old. Imagine being in your early 50s and realizing the role you've been performing for half your life no longer even feels like you anymore. That kind of grief doesn't always explode dramatically. Sometimes it just sits quietly inside a person for years. But no performance can last 26 years without the person inside it breaking down. And Grace was broken. Now, given everything we just talked about, does what happened on September 13, 1982 hit differently? Because it absolutely should. The final year. What Grace was quietly planning. Before we get to the crash itself, we need to pause on something that almost never gets mentioned in the standard Grace Kelly retrospective. Because 1982 wasn't just the year Grace died. It was the year she was finally starting to reclaim herself. And that makes everything that happened on that mountain road even more devastating than it already was. By the early 1980s, something had shifted in Grace. The depression was still there. The unhappiness inside her marriage hadn't magically resolved. But there's consistent reporting from people close to her during that period that Grace had reached a kind of turning point. Not a dramatic public declaration, not a confrontation, more like a quiet, private decision that she was going to start making choices for herself again, even if those choices had to exist within the confines of palace life. She had become increasingly serious about her poetry work. What had started as a gentle creative outlet had evolved into something she genuinely cared about, genuinely worked at, and genuinely wanted an audience for. She was touring Europe with her poetry readings, appearing at literary festivals, building a creative identity that existed separately from her role as princess. People who attended those readings consistently described an almost electric quality to her on stage. A woman who, for the duration of those performances, seemed fully alive in a way that her official royal appearances didn't capture. That was Grace Kelly, not Princess Grace. Grace. She was also reportedly in conversations, real, serious conversations, about a potential return to film. Not starring, necessarily, producing, or perhaps a carefully chosen character role that could be framed in a way that even Monaco's palace couldn't object to. The idea hadn't crystallized into anything formal yet, but the fact that she was entertaining it at all, after decades of simply accepting the ban, suggests something had fundamentally changed in her thinking about her own life. Friends from that period describe someone who had stopped waiting for Rainier's approval and started asking different questions. Not, what is he going to allow, but, what do I actually want? That sounds like a small shift. It wasn't. For a woman who had spent 26 years navigating one of the most controlling environments imaginable, it was enormous. There were also quiet signals that her relationship with her children was entering a new phase. Caroline had already married, started her own family, and was establishing herself as a serious figure in Monegasque public life. Albert was moving into official royal duties. Stephanie, the youngest, was 17 and about to step into the kind of independence that comes with late adolescence. Grace was approaching the end of the most intensive years of active mothering, and there's evidence she was starting to think seriously about what came next for her, personally. Some people in her circle have said over the years that Grace seemed not happy exactly, but purposeful in those final months in a way she hadn't in a long time. Like a woman who had spent decades in a holding pattern and had finally decided to start moving again. She was 52 years old. By any reasonable measure, she had decades ahead of her. Decades in which, maybe, Grace Kelly might have found her way back to some version of herself. And then September 13th happened, and everything she was quietly building toward, every tentative step back toward her own life, ended on a mountain road outside La Tourbe. That's what the palace's carefully managed press releases never told you. It wasn't just a woman who died in a car crash. It was a woman on the edge of her own quiet comeback, finally, after all those years, who never got to see it through. The car crash. What the palace hid from the world. Okay, September 13th, 1982. This is the day everything ends, and the day the Monaco Palace decided to start lying. Grace was driving her 11-year-old Rover from the family's summer home at Roc Aigle down the winding mountain roads toward Monaco. In the passenger seat was her youngest daughter, Stephanie, who was 17 years old at the time. About 2 miles outside the village of La Tourbe, something went wrong. Medical investigators later concluded that Grace had suffered a stroke, a cerebral vascular incident, while behind the wheel. She complained of a headache. She appeared to momentarily black out, and then she lost control of the car. The vehicle missed a sharp turn and plunged 120 feet down a steep mountain embankment. Stephanie survived. She later recalled that Grace seemed unable to stop the car, and that she herself tried pulling the handbrake, but it made no difference. Grace was rushed to the hospital. And here is where it gets infuriating, because the Monaco Palace immediately began issuing false statements to the public. The palace told the public that Princess Grace was stable and recovering from injuries like a broken thigh, collarbone, and ribs. The way the updates were framed made people believe she would eventually pull through. But behind the scenes, the reality was far more devastating. Grace had suffered a catastrophic brain hemorrhage connected to a stroke, and she never regained consciousness after the crash. Doctors reportedly understood almost immediately that her condition was critical and likely fatal, while the public was still being reassured that the princess was recovering. Which means that while millions of people around the world were anxiously waiting for hopeful updates, Grace Kelly was already dying. The hospital's own medical staff later criticized the palace's official statements as deeply misleading. Because the truth? Grace had suffered a catastrophic brain hemorrhage from the stroke. She was never conscious after the crash. She never regained consciousness. And the doctors knew from the moment she arrived that she was dying. The public was waiting for news of her recovery while Grace Kelly was already slipping away. On September 14, 1982, she suffered a second brain hemorrhage. She was 52 years old. Princess Grace of Monaco was gone. And the question that still haunts investigators to this day: did the stroke cause the crash? Or did the crash cause the brain hemorrhage? The exact sequence remains uncertain. What is known is that Grace may have confused the brake and accelerator, or her legs simply stopped functioning due to the stroke before she could stop the car. Either way, one of the most iconic women of the 20th century died on a mountain road, and the institution she'd devoted her life to spent her final hours managing the PR of it. But here's what I want to know. How did Rainier, the man who controlled her life, cope with losing her? Rainier. After Grace, a man haunted. Here's the complicated part of this story. And I say complicated because I genuinely don't think Prince Rainier was a simple villain. I think he was a deeply flawed man who didn't know how to love someone without diminishing them. A man shaped by a monarchy that valued duty, image, and continuity, and who probably never learned the language of emotional intimacy. Because after Grace died, Rainier fell apart. Prince Albert, their son, later said his father was deeply affected by Grace's death, that he wasn't quite the same man afterward. And by every account, that's true. Rainier never remarried. He lived for 23 more years, until his own death in 2005, and he never let another woman into his life. He said in interviews that he was so haunted by memories of Princess Grace that he simply couldn't move forward. And the children? Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie each carved out complicated, often turbulent public lives in the years after their mother's death. Stephanie, in particular, the teenager who survived that mountain road, spent much of her adult life in the public eye for all the wrong reasons, struggling visibly with the weight of what she had witnessed and what she had lost. It's impossible to separate the trajectory of the Grimaldi children's lives from the trauma of September 14, 1982. Now this raises an uncomfortable question. Did Rainier love Grace? I think he probably did, in whatever way he was capable of. But loving someone and treating them well are two very different things. You can grieve someone deeply and still have been the source of their unhappiness when they were alive. Grief doesn't erase the emotional neglect. It doesn't give back the acting career. It doesn't undo 26 years of distance, control, and isolation. Rainier spent 23 years haunted by Grace's memory. Grace spent 26 years quietly mourning the life she gave up to be his wife. And somehow, the fairy tale version of this story is the one that gets told at every wedding, in every magazine feature, in every retrospective about the most glamorous couple of the 20th century. The real story is right here, and it is so much more heartbreaking. So after everything, the control, the neglect, the depression, the crash. What is the actual legacy of Grace Kelly's life? What does her story really tell us? The legacy, what Grace Kelly's story tells us. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about Grace Kelly's life. She was a woman who had everything the world told her to want: beauty, talent, fame, wealth, a crown. And she traded the things that actually made her herself, her career, her freedom, her friendships, her creative life, for a role that slowly consumed her. And the world applauded her for it, called it a fairy tale. Her children have spent decades trying to reckon with who their mother really was beneath the image. Stephanie, who was in that car on that mountain road, has spoken about the trauma of that day in fragments over the years, a day that changed her life forever and that she spent her whole adult life processing. Grace Kelly deserved better. She deserved a partner who saw her as a full human being, not a publicity asset and a political solution. She deserved to keep making movies. She deserved friends and freedom and a life that felt like hers. Instead, she got a palace and a crown and 26 years of a marriage that slowly hollowed her out. That's the tragedy of Grace Kelly. Not the car crash, as devastating as that was. The tragedy started on April 19, 1956, on the day the whole world said, "Congratulations." And that, right there, is the real story that got buried under decades of royal glamour and palace press releases. If this video blew your mind the way it blew mine when I went down this rabbit hole, please, please hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And if you're new here and you're into deep dives on history's most iconic figures and the stories that didn't make it into the official version, subscribe. We do this every week. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, but stay skeptical of fairy tales.